So viewing light early in the day, ideally sunlight, is key for establishing healthy sleep-wake rhythms and for allowing you to fall asleep easily at night. Blue light is great for this mechanism during the day. After doing that for a few days, that increases your total sleep time and shifts forward the time at which you feel sleepy. It makes you want to go to bed earlier each night. When light comes into the eye, there's a particular group of retinal ganglion cells that perceives a particular type of light and communicates that to this clock that resides right above the roof of your mouth, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So I know this can get a little complicated, but these retinal ganglion cells, when you open your eyes, light comes in and an electrical signal is sent to this central clock we call the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus has connections with essentially every cell and organ of your body. Now, it's vitally important that we get light communicated to this central clock in order to time the cortisol and melatonin properly. When I say properly, I can say that with confidence because we know, based on a lot of evidence, that if you don't get your cortisol and melatonin rhythms right, there are tremendously broad and bad effects on cardiovascular health, dementia, metabolic effects, learning, depression, dementia. So let's think about what happens when we do this correctly and how to do it correctly. When we wake up, our eyes open. Now, if we're in a dark room, there isn't enough light to trigger the correct timing of this cortisol melatonin thing. You might say, well, why won't any light do it? Well, it turns out that these neurons in our eye that set the circadian clock and then allow our circadian clock to set all the clocks of all the cells and organs and tissues of our body responds best to a particular quality of light and amount of light. And those are the qualities of light and amount of light that come from sunlight. So these neurons, what they're really looking for, although they don't have a mind of their own, is the sun at what we call low solar angle. The eye and the nervous system don't know anything about sunrises or sunsets. It only knows the quality of light that comes in when the sun is low in the sky. The system evolved so that when the sun is low in the sky, there's a particular contrast between yellows and blues that triggers the activation of these cells. So if you wake up and you look at your phone or your computer or you flip on a bunch of artificial lights, will these cells be activated? And the answer is sort of. They'll be activated, but not in the optimal way. What you want to do is get sunlight in your eyes as close to waking as possible. However, if you wake up a few hours after the sunrise, which I tend to most days personally, you still want to get outside and view sunlight. You don't need the sunlight beaming you directly in the eyes. There's a lot of photons, light energy, that's scattered from sunlight at this time. But the key is to get that light energy from sunlight, ideally, into your eyes. I had a discussion with a colleague of mine, Dr. Jamie Zeitzer, and he tells me that it's 50 times less effective to view this sunlight through a window, through a car windshield, or through a side window of a car, than it is to just get outside with no sunglasses and view light early in the day. Now, if you can't see the sunrise, like I said, you can see this within an hour or two of sunrise, but it has to be low solar angle. Once the sun is overhead, the quality of light shifts so that you miss this opportunity to time the cortisol pulse. And that turns out to be a bad thing to do. You really want to time that cortisol pulse properly because we'll get into this a little bit more later, but a late shifted cortisol pulse, in particular a 9 p.m. or 8 p.m. increase in cortisol, is one of the consequences and maybe one of the causes of a lot of anxiety disorders and depression. Bringing that cortisol pulse earlier in your wakeful period, earlier in your day, has positive benefits ranging from blood pressure to mental health, etc. Many positive things happen when you are getting the cortisol early in the day, far away from your melatonin pulse. Okay, so how long should you be outside? Even if there's a lot of dense cloud cover, you're probably getting anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 lux, L-U-X, which is just a measure of light energy. And that should be sufficient to set the circadian clock. So many people find that they need to use sunlight simulators in the form of particular lights that were designed to simulate sunlight. However, I'm not out to attack the companies that produce those. There's another solution to that. You can simply go outside for longer. You could say, well, the lights in my house or my phone are really, really bright, right? Everyone's telling us to stay off our phones at night because they're really bright. But guess what? It turns out that early in the day, your retina is not very sensitive, which means you need a lot of photons, ideally coming from sunlight, to set these clock mechanisms. So looking at your phone or artificial lights is fine if you wake up before sunrise, but it's not going to work to set these clock mechanisms. And this is supported by dozens, if not hundreds, of quality peer-reviewed studies. So you want to use sunlight. If you can't see sunlight because of your environment, then you are going to have to opt for artificial light. And in that case, you're going to want an artificial light that either simulates sunlight or has a lot of blue light. Now, without going off course here, you might be saying, wait, I've heard blue light is bad for me. Actually, blue light is great for this mechanism during the day. So viewing light early in the day, ideally sunlight, is key for establishing healthy sleep-wake rhythms and for allowing you to fall asleep easily at night. Now, it's not going to make sure that all that happens every single time, but it is the foundation of proper sleep and what we call circadian health. It governs metabolism and so many other things that are supposed to exist on a regular 24-hour cycle. So if you are not feeling awake during the day and you're having trouble sleeping, get the sunlight exposure that we just talked about. But in addition to that, if you want to become an early riser, for instance, and you want to feel more awake during the early part of the day, by getting that light exposure and exercising early in the day, you will, after 2 or 3 days, you will naturally start to wake up earlier in the day. And that's because these clock mechanisms have shifted. It's like setting the clock earlier as opposed to delaying the clock. And that takes us to a somewhat complicated but very important aspect to all this, which is what sets the clock and keeps it anchored. The main thing is that bright light early in the day. The other thing is sunset. There was a really nice study that showed that viewing sunlight around the time of sunset, doesn't have to be just crossing the horizon, but circa sunset, within an hour or so of sunset, prevents some of the bad effects of light in preventing melatonin release later that same night. So let me repeat this. Viewing light early in the day is key. Viewing light later in the day when the sun is setting or around that time can help protect these mechanisms, your brain and body, against the negative effects of light later in the day. So let me talk about how you would do that. You'd go view the sunset, or you would go outside in the late afternoon or evening. Again, if you want to do this through a window at work, that's fine, but it'll take 50 times longer. So the best thing to do is just to get outside for a few minutes, anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes, also in the afternoon. Having those two signals arriving to your central clock, that your body, your internal world knows when it's morning and knows when it's evening, is tremendously powerful. There's always a lot of questions about how long, how much, how do I know if I've had enough? You'll know because your rhythm will start to fall into some degree of normalcy. You'll start to wake up at more or less the same time each day. You'll fall asleep more easily at night. Generally, it takes about 2 or 3 days for these systems to align. So if you've not been doing these behaviors, it's going to take a few days, but they can have tremendous benefits and sometimes rather quickly on a number of different mental and physical aspects of your health. Now let's talk about the bad effects of light, which is the longer you've been awake, the more sensitive your retina and these cells are to light. So that if you've been awake for 10, 12, 14 hours, it becomes very easy for even a small amount of light coming from a screen or from an overhead light to trigger the activation of the clock and make you feel like you want to stay up later, make it harder to fall asleep and disrupt your sleep pattern. Okay, so the simple way to think about this is you want as much light as is safely possible early in the day, morning and throughout the day, including blue light, and you want as little light coming into your eyes, artificial or sunlight, after, say, 8 p.m. And certainly you do not want to get bright light exposure to your eyes between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. And here's why. Light that arrives to the eyes between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. approximately suppresses the release of dopamine, this neuromodulator that makes us feel good, is sort of an endogenous antidepressant, and can inhibit learning and create all sorts of other detrimental effects. It does this through a mechanism, for those of you who want to know the neural pathways, that involves light to the eyes that's then signaled to a structure called the habenula. When that habenula gets activated, it's actually called the disappointment nucleus, because it actually makes us feel less happy and more disappointed, and can lead to certain forms of depression in the wakeful state. Now, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you need to use the bathroom, or you're on an all-night flight and you need to read or whatever it is, fine. It's, every once in a while, it's not going to be a problem to get bright light exposure to your eyes in the middle of the night. But if you think about our lifestyle nowadays and being up late looking at phones, even if you dim that screen, you're triggering this activation, because your retinal sensitivity and the sensitivity of these neurons has gone up late in the day. One of the best ways you can support your mechanisms for good mood, mental health, learning, focus, metabolism, etc., is to take control of this light exposure behavior at night and not get much or any bright light exposure in the middle of the night. And that brings me to an important point, which is about the location of light. This hasn't been discussed much out there, I don't think. These cells in our eye, these neurons that signal the central clock, reside mostly, not exclusively, but mostly in the bottom half of our retina. And because we have a lens in front of our retina, and because of the optics of lenses, that means that these cells are actually viewing our upper visual field. These cells are in the bottom half of your retina mostly, and so they're viewing the overhead visual space around you. This is probably not coincidental that these cells were essentially designed to detect sunlight, which is overhead, of course. So if you want to avoid improper activation of these neurons, it's better to place lights that you use in the evening low in your physical environment, so on desktops or even the floor, if you want to go that way, as opposed to overhead lights. So overhead fluorescent lights would be the worst. That would be the worst case scenario. Lights that are overhead that are a little bit softer, of the sort of yellow or reddish tints, would be slightly better. But dim lights that are set low in the room are going to be best, because they aren't going to activate these neurons and therefore shift your circadian clock. So that's a goal. Some people like Samer, the Hattar that I mentioned earlier, he turns his home basically into a cave in the evenings. Candlelight actually does not trigger activation of these cells. So candlelight and fireplaces and campfires are fine. You can actually use light to wake up earlier. Jamie Zeitzer and colleagues did a beautiful study showing that if you turn on the lights before waking up, so around 45 minutes to an hour before waking up, even if your eyelids are closed, provided you're not under the covers, after doing that for a few days, that increases your total sleep time and shifts forward the time at which you feel sleepy. It makes you want to go to bed earlier each night. Now, in a kind of diabolical way, they did this with teenagers who are notorious for wanting to wake up late and stay up late. And what they found was bright light flashes, just turning on the lights in their environment, overhead lights, because they're trying to activate the system, and that's why they're using overhead lights, even through the eyelids, before these kids woke up, then made those kids naturally want to go to bed earlier, and they ended up sleeping longer. So that's something you could try. You could put your lights on a timer to go on early in the day before you wake up. You could open your blinds so that sunlight is coming through. Now, again, if you curl up under the covers, then it's not going to reach these neurons. But it's remarkable the light can actually penetrate the eyelids, activate these neurons, and go to the central clock. That study illustrates a really important principle of how you're built, which is you have the capacity for what are called phase advances and phase delays. And I don't want to complicate this too much. So the simplest way to think about phase advances and phase delays is that if you see light late in the day, and in particular in the middle of the night, your brain and body, for reasons that now you understand, will think that that's morning light, even though it's not sunlight, because you have this heightened sensitivity. And it will phase delay. It will delay your clock. It will essentially make you want to get up later and go to sleep later. So if you get light exposure too late in the evening or in the middle of the night, It's going to make it hard to want to wake up the next morning early and to go to bed early. The opposite is also true. If you wake up early, say, 6 a.m. or 7 a.m., and get light exposure, or even earlier, 4 a.m., and get light exposure, it will phase advance your clock. Okay, it's going to make your clock think it's earlier, and you'll want to wake up earlier. So the simple way to think about this is if you're having trouble waking up early and feeling alert early in the day, you're going to want to try and get bright light exposure even before waking up, because it will advance your clock. It's sort of like turning the clock forward. Whereas if you are having trouble waking up early, you definitely don't want to get too much light exposure or any light exposure to your eyes late in the evening and in the middle of the night, because it's just going to delay your clock more and more. So rather than get into the specifics of everybody's situation, because there are many of you out there with different situations and lifestyle requirements, etc., the way to think about this is that you have these internal mechanisms of adenosine and circadian clocks, and they're always operating. And what you're trying to do is provide them anchors. You're trying to provide them consistent, powerful anchors so that your cortisol, your melatonin, and then everything that cascades down from that, like your metabolism and your ability to learn and your sense of alertness, your dopamine, your serotonin, all that stuff is timed regularly. One of the reasons why there's so much challenge out there with focus and anxiety and depression, there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is that people's internal mechanisms aren't anchored to anything regular. Now, this doesn't require being neurotically attached to getting up at a very specific time, going outside, viewing the sunlight same time every day. These systems, again, will average, but if you can provide them consistent light anchors early in the day and in the evening and avoiding light at night, you will be amazed at the tremendous number of positive effects that can come from that at the level of metabolic factors, hormones, and just general feelings of well-being. In fact, most of us are familiar with what it is to not sleep well and all the terrible effects that has. Maybe one night you're fine, 2 nights even. For the new parents out there, I sympathize with you. But most people are not familiar with what it is to sleep really, really well on a consistent basis.